Philistine is the westernmost of the provinces of Syria. In its greatest length from Rafah to the boundary of El-Lajun, it would take a rider 2 days to travel over, and a lifetime to cross the province in its breadth from Jaffa to Riha, or Jericho. Al-Jibal and Ash-Sharq, being two separate provinces that lie contiguous one to the other, are included in Philistine and belong to its government. Philistine is watered by the rains and the dew. Its trees and its plowed lands do not need artificial irrigation. And it is only in Nablus that you find the running waters applied to this purpose. Philistine is the most fertile of the Syrian provinces. Its capital and largest town is Ar-Ramla, but the holy city of Jerusalem comes very near this last in size. In the province of Philistine, despite its small extent, there are about 20 mosques with pulpits for the Friday prayer. Now, this passage was written by Al-Maqdisi, a 10th century Arab geographer, and his description of Philistine, Palestine, establishes an identity for the territory which was known to the Arabs and Muslims of the time and has persisted in the same identity to the present day. And it's known by Palestinians, and indeed all Arabs, as occupying precise borders of the territory we call Palestine and that Al-Maqdisi calls Philistine.
I'll never forget what I saw at the Palestinian refugee camps. Men, women, and children, their bodies stacked up in piles.
Clouds of white tear gas drifted over the area. Many of the worshippers moved quickly out of the mosque.
We have to be more surgical in our action.
Some of them are waving homemade flags of Palestine, and a flag which is outlawed in Israel.
The Palestinian revolution continues.
Jordan River, Dead Sea, Jericho, Nablus, Nazira, Jaffa, Mediterranean Sea, Hebron, Zachariah, Bethlehem, Jerusalem, Palestine. Palestine.
Palestine is the name used since Greek and Roman times to describe the land at the eastern end of the Mediterranean between the sea and the Jordan River. For thousands of years, Palestine has been the crossroads of the Middle East on the great trading routes that link the Orient with the Mediterranean, Africa with Asia. Palestine has been fought over countless times, and many civilizations have left their traces on a land steeped in history. Jericho is one of the oldest settled communities known to mankind. The ancient Jewish kingdom of David once flourished here, until destroyed by the Assyrians. The Phoenicians were superseded by the Romans, whose province of Palestina was made up of many major cities. The Arabs captured Palestine from the Byzantines in the 7th century, and the Abbasid dynasty succeeded the Umayyads. The Crusaders conquered the area at the end of the 11th century, and for 200 years a Latin kingdom ruled over part of the land, until falling to the Mamluk sultans from Egypt. In the 16th century, the whole region was absorbed by the Ottomans into the Turkish Empire, ruled from Constantinople. All these peoples and cultures have come and gone over the centuries, and all have left behind something marking their presence. The Palestinians see themselves as heirs and successors to this rich tradition.
Palestine is something special, something unique about it, inhabited by the Philistines, who gave their name to the country, the ancient Jews, the Aramaic people. You have a variety of Semitics, Aramaic, Hamitics, blacks. I think when we discuss the Palestinian people today, we are talking essentially about the Palestinian Arabs. The Palestinian Arabs means Palestinian Arabs who are Muslims, Palestinian Arabs who are Christians, Palestinian Arabs who are Jews. That is in the sense that they are indigenous to the land.
Palestine's special place in history and in the imagination derives from its role as cradle for three great religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Jerusalem, holy city to all three religions, was the site of Solomon's temple, whose ancient walls are sacred to Jews today. For Christians, Palestine is the Holy Land. For centuries, its shrines have attracted pilgrims from around the Christian world. For Muslims, Jerusalem is their third, and the Dome of the Rock marks the spot where the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven.
Palestine is obviously not just another piece of land. It's the center for Judaism and Christianity, and has a lot to do with Islam. And it's the site of extraordinarily important occurrences for Western religion and civilization. So that by the Middle Ages, for example, Jerusalem was considered the center of the earth. And it was the land of miracles. No other place is so saturated with religious and then subsequently cultural and then beyond that romantic, or if you like even sentimental notions. So I think it's the one place outside of the European metropolis where everyone has wanted to go, and not only just go but also claim it for some cause, some sect, some idea. It was just a place where you had to be because it was the one place in a certain sense validated your history as a European power.
In the last 200 years, the European obsession with the land of Palestine has developed into a cult of Orientalism. Writers, travelers, photographers, and painters have constructed an image of the romantic, exotic land of the Orient, reflecting their own fantasies and desires, inhabited by a mysterious people who've almost stopped in time. Modern figures blend into biblical scenes. This perception of the Orient was a distortion of reality, but it helped to sustain and endorse Western colonial domination over the area. The Oriental cult justified the power of the West over the Orient.
For Christians and Jews, the land of Palestine is just drenched in almost every rock, every place has a biblical meaning, and people who have read the Bible, whether Jewish or Christian, go to Palestine in order to see there restored or in some way commemorated the events of the Bible. I remember my father telling me as a boy, when he was growing up in the early years of the 20th century in Jerusalem, one of the things he would do, and he found it perfectly natural to do that, was to sell crowns of thorns to visiting German and British tourists who came there looking on the Mount of Olives, looking for bits of Palestine to take home with them.
The tourists who flock to Israel today are the latest in the line of pilgrims and visitors who want to capture the spirit of the Holy Land.
Lean back, lean back, lean back.
It's just a pound coin.
Unless the banks here can change.
Hidden behind these myths and expectations lies the history of the indigenous people of the area, the Palestinians. For generations, the Palestinians have been primarily a settled people, living in villages and farming the land. The main activity was the citrus industry, and the principal trade was the export of oranges through Palestine's major port, Jaffa. The majority of Palestinians were Muslims. There was an important Christian minority, and there had always been small communities of Orthodox Jews.
Well, I think Palestine is unique in the Arab world in the sense that the Muslims were very familiar with the Christians, and the Christians were familiar with the Muslims. The Muslims were familiar with the Jews, and the Jews were familiar with the Muslims and the Christians. As I grew up in the land, I knew something about Easter, I knew something about Christmas. It's not mine, but I used to see the festival in the Christian section of the city. On Saturday, I knew that the Jews must not do something about the light, and they used to hire us, in fact, to go and turn off the candle or turn off the light. They would pay us, 5 pennies or whatever it is. We knew something about kosher food. We knew all of that. There was a tremendous amount of interchange of not only information, but real knowledge and respect.
After the fast of Yom Kippur, the Arabs used to come to our home and bring us the pitas, the food. After their holidays, we used to go to and visit them. Arabs and Jews lived in such a way that there were no differences. As a matter of fact, we didn't ask whether this one is an Arab or a Jew. We spoke Arabic at home. My mother language was Arabic. And the way we were dressed, the way we felt, our tradition was exactly the same.
Although most of the people were farmers, there were important urban centers. Here, people were engaged in commerce and industry. The cities were proud and vibrant, and it was here that there was the greatest exchange of ideas with the West. Schools, colleges, religious societies helped encourage the development of a middle class with a conscious sense of a Palestinian identity. Political influence was still concentrated in the hands of a few traditional families. By the early 20th century, there were the first stirrings against Turkish rule amid a general awakening of Arab nationalism. At this time, there was no separate Ottoman province of Palestine. The area was subdivided into several districts, all administered from Beirut and Damascus. The total population of Palestine amounted to about 500,000 Palestinian Arabs living in some 800 villages and in a score of cities and towns. But in the 1880s, the first Zionist settlers began to arrive from Europe, inspired by an entirely new type of movement. As a political movement, Zionism was born at a time of intense European nationalist rivalry. Founded by a group of Jewish intellectuals, the Zionist movement looked to the acquisition of land in Palestine as the first stage in the creation of a Jewish state, as a refuge from centuries of persecution. Wealthy European Jews, like the Rothschilds, financed the building of early Zionist settlements in Palestine. Zionists began to settle on the land that was special to them. The seeds of the conflict over the land of Palestine in modern times were sown.
I think that the Zionist success in Palestine was premised on the notion that there was no one in Palestine, or if there was, they weren't worth bothering about. And certainly the case that the Zionists made to the West was essentially, as Israel Zangwill put it, that it was a people without land going to a land without people. And that slogan caught it very neatly. So that the Palestinians, who were obviously there and were in fact seen, I mean, they couldn't have not been seen, and they were even seen in some of the films and pictures of the time, and even descriptions of the time, were almost always treated not as a people, capital A, capital P, but as inconsequential nomads, as miscellaneous peasants, as people without any important identity or attachment to the land. They were, as one of the early Zionist settlers in the 20s put it, they were like the rocks of Judea that could be removed. They were an obstacle, but they could just be put aside, and they had pretty much the consciousness of rocks. In other words, not very much.
Clearly, the missionaries would have told the Zionists at the time that there are a people in Palestine, And therefore, the Zionists came up with the answer, yes, there are a people in Palestine, but they are backward, they are nomads, they are Bedouins, and therefore the act of Jewish settlement in Palestine would in fact be beneficial to these people. So they are not out to hurt the people, they are actually were out to benefit them. Much in the same way that European imperialist powers were selling their idea of civilizing the Afro-Asian, which justified the whole idea of colonial control of the Afro-Asian world. So in that sense, the Zionists shared with the Europeans an attitude of superiority based on a very deep sense of racism.
The First World War transformed the situation in Palestine. The British and French fought the Ottoman Turks, who were allies of Germany. In 1917, to divert attention from the stalemate on the Western Front, the British invaded Palestine. The Arabs had been offered independence from the Turks if they supported the Allied war effort. Many Arabs rose in revolt. Slowly at first, then more rapidly, the Allies advanced from Egypt through Gaza into Palestine. The land that had seen countless armies come and go now witnessed the advance of a modern 20th century army. In December 1917, the British captured Jerusalem. General Allenby made a triumphant entry into the city, the first Christian conqueror since the Crusades. But the British had made other promises too. In November 1917, Foreign Secretary Balfour announced British government support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. This promise became known as the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration contained an important but apparently contradictory proviso that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine.
The Balfour Declaration that promised or committed the British government to facilitate the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine, irrespective of the second provision of it, that the indigenous population's civil and religious rights will be protected, that silly phrase that the British used, without identifying the indigenous population in terms of their national identity and culture, clearly was understood by the Palestinians and by the Arabs in general exactly as it turned out to be. That is, it is a promise on the part of the British government, in fact, to facilitate the establishment of a Jewish state.
In early 1918, the British military authorities allowed a Zionist commission to visit Palestine, led by Chaim Weizmann, who had helped negotiate the Balfour Declaration. The commission began to plan for the building of a Jewish homeland. The Palestinian Arabs, already suspicious about the designs of the Zionists, protested. To them, Zionism seemed to be bound up with British rule. At the end of the war, the Arabs turned to the British and the French Sharif Faisal, the leader of the Arab revolt, whose armies had helped the Allies to defeat the Turks, went to meet the British generals in Damascus. The Arab peoples now looked to the Allies to act on the promises they had made in the war and to fulfill their side of the bargain. They hoped at last to achieve the independence that had been denied them by the Turks. But the Arab hopes were frustrated by a secret agreement reached during the course of the war, known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement. The British and the French had decided to carve up the whole region into their own spheres of influence. After the war, under the guise of League of Nations mandates, the French had the areas that became known as Lebanon and Syria. The British had the areas called Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq. National homeland in Palestine. The arrival of the first High Commissioner, Sir Herbert Samuel, was marked by protests amongst the Arabs. To the Palestinians, the mandate not only denied them the right to independence, but also legitimized the claims of another people to their land.
And when the mandate was imposed on Palestine, we call it a mandate, I mean, that's another euphemism, you know, for colonial control. I mean, the British imposed their colonial control in the wake of the actual military occupation of Palestine. And regardless of the promises they have made to the Arabs, let's forget about that. In the pursuit of the Sykes-Picot Agreement and all the agreements they have made with European powers, they obviously intended to divide the Arab world, to control it, distribute it between it and France, and to establish in Palestine the Jewish national homeland.
The history of the Palestinians was now bound up with British imperial policy. Their future was set on a course they neither wanted nor were consulted upon. The consequences were to be increasingly bitter. The Palestinians were traditionally a farming people, living and working in villages scattered throughout Palestine. For the peasant farmer, there existed a strong bond with the land, the source of a family's livelihood and its wealth, built up through generations of cultivating the soil. Abu Muhammad is typical of many. He used to farm the fertile lands of a village called Safuri, in a lush plain just outside Nazareth in the north of Palestine.
من 500 سنة سبفريكم المقبرة هاي تبعنا الأتراك حكمت 450 سنة وإحنا موجودين في الأتراك سيدي وأبوي 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 مع الأتراك ولنا الأرض اللي هي بنملكها لا رحناش ولا جينا وأنا هون.
Centuries of working the soil gave to the Palestinian peasant farmer a strong sense of belonging to the land. But this bond was not based on the same formal concept of land ownership as in the West.
The property of land in the past was, as it was called, al-masha. That's collective ownership of the land. Everyone who worked the land owned it. He doesn't own it, but as long as he works it, it is his.
The Ottomans began a process of land registration which gave formal titles to the land. But in many villages, the land was simply classed as common land. Under the British administration, this land passed to the state and could be bought on the open market. Other tracts of land were registered, often by absentee landlords acquiring vast estates in Syria and Palestine in return for services to the Ottomans. This land, too, could be sold quite legally, and there began a massive transfer of tens of thousands of acres from Palestinian farmers to Zionist settlers.
Bye.
the Jews from the crowded ghettos of Europe, Palestine represented a liberation. Here Jews could buy land and build their society through their own labors, and this was seen as a form of national redemption. Young Jews from Europe began to arrive in Palestine by the thousand. Each new settlement was seen as bringing the Zionist dream of building a Jewish homeland nearer. But for the Palestinians, each new settler threatened a future in which they would have no place on their own land.
Well, to establish a Jewish national homeland, you needed two things. You needed people, and you needed land. These were the two important spokes, as it were. The people, obviously, were the immigrants, colonial settlers, who appeared, in fact, to the Palestinians as colonial settlers, much in the same way that British settlers in what used to be called Rhodesia or in South Africa. We viewed the Jewish settlements because it is composed of European people who spoke European languages. They are not indigenous Jews, and they came in the wake of the British administration that is committed to transform this. So we knew as Palestinians that the two things that are taking place, the increase in the Jewish population of Palestine, an increase that's coming from Europe, and second, they needed the land, okay? And the major land areas that were bought, in fact, by the colonization societies, by the Karen Qayemet, were bought from Lebanese or Syrian absentee landlords who had nothing to do with the land, but the tillers of the land, and that was a major issue, were evicted from those lands. So there had developed an understanding by the Palestinians that with each Jewish migration, there is an expulsion of the Arabs and there is an acquisition of land.
The threat to the Palestinians was that land once acquired by the Zionists was declared inalienable from the Jewish people. It could never revert to the Arabs who had worked the land for generations.
And we could not help but feel, in fact, that the growth of this alternative society that literally had nothing to do with the Palestinian Arab society, that stood in antagonism to Palestinian Arab society, we could see that at a certain point in time, that society is going to overwhelm us.
To finance the building of the Jewish state, hundreds of thousands of dollars had to be raised abroad. The call of Zion had to be loud and uncompromising.
They are coming now to a land which accepts them as its own, and not merely as strangers to be tolerated. Tomorrow they will march to their work to build roads, to drill wells, and bring the hidden water to restore to Palestine's soil its long-neglected fruitfulness. The Tel Aviv beach is the greatest place of recreation in Palestine.
This was a shock to the Palestinians, who began to be aware of the plans, the real plans of the Zionists who are coming to Palestine. They began to see that the Zionists are coming to take the land and to push the Palestinians out of it, and so they decided to resist.
Violence became endemic. There were major riots against Jewish communities in 1929, in 1933, and in 1934, leaving hundreds dead. The Jews accused the British of failing to preserve law and order.
We had those uprisings in Palestine from time to time. Every year we had uprising, and it lasted sometimes for months. And we always heard about those heroes and the fighters that were fighting the British Army and then the Zionists. All this created in us this feeling of nationalism.
The 1930s saw a dramatic increase in the number of Zionist immigrants to Palestine. from 4,000 in 1931 to over 60,000 in 1935, many fleeing from the rise of Hitler in Germany. The Palestinians feared being swamped by these new settlers. A sense of panic and desperation spread amongst them. The leader of the Palestinian national movement was Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem, a religious dignitary. The Mufti took a hawkish line, arguing that compromise with Britain or the Zionists was impossible, and only armed resistance could save the day. His political rivals, the Nashashibi family, looked for forms of accommodation with both the British and the Zionists, but the time for compromise was running out. In April 1936, the Arab Higher Committee called for a general strike. The response was widespread, and the strike lasted a full 6 months, paralyzing much of the commercial life of Palestine. The general strike was followed by a major uprising which lasted from 1936 to 1939. Convoys were ambushed, government officials were murdered, outlying Jewish settlements were attacked. Fighters roamed the hills calling up local villagers as volunteers. Oil pipelines and railways were frequent targets for sabotage. The intention was to make Palestine ungovernable, and so this uprising was directed against British rule.
We carried arms against the British and not against the Jews, because we regarded the British, that Britain was our main enemy. Because the British occupied our land, and we were asking for our freedom.
Terrorism is turning into open revolt in Palestine, and British troops and police are up against a tough proposition. With every Arab a nationalist, any apparently peaceful citizen may be carrying a bomb. And to catch a murderer in an Oriental city is like looking for a rabbit in a well-organized warren. Added to which, the Arabs have a perfect lookout system in their minarets. As the Mueddin call the faithful to prayer, by altering a few syllables undecipherable to Europeans, they can give warning of the approach of police and direct their friends below to safety.
The British authorities responded with a huge clampdown on the Arab population. Massive roundups of suspects took place.
ليش؟ مع 36 كانوا يجوا طوقوا البلد ونزلوهن ويعتقلوا فيهن شهرين 3 5 سنة. أنا اعتقلوني سنة وروحت عدارنا عبستنا ما جابوش واحد غريب أخذوه.
ليش كان المقاومة هاي؟ عشان إيش؟
المقاومة بدناش نطلع من بلادنا، أرضنا إلنا.
Very frequently, the military would stage an operation around selected villages in areas where intelligence reports had come in that the leaders of the local Arab gangs were operating. And although I was a CID detective sergeant at the time, I was detailed on one occasion to go to accompany the Black Watch to Ein Karim with a list of our known suspects, and because I was an Arabic speaker, to interrogate them. We didn't have much success that day, but when the Black Watch searched the local church, they found a young man dressed up in girls' clothing in the belfry and brought him up for interrogation. I'm afraid some of the jocks got hold of him where to hurt him most, just to see if he was a girl.
A village is being blown up in Palestine. This is one instance of energetic measures being undertaken to stamp out terrorism. From the village of Miyar, shots were fired at British troops. The villagers declined to surrender the culprits or the rifles, so it was a case of reprisals. The lorries of mechanized infantry are parked in the valley during the punitive action. Armored cars patrol the roads, while artillery is brought into operation as a warning to Arabs lurking in the adjacent hills.
يعتقلوا يعني بكل غرامات يدفعون غرامه يفرضوا على القريه غرامه مبلغ اللي ما تقدرش تقوم فيه. ومن الجمله بلدنا اللي هي البلوه صار حدها اللغم وطلع بالجيش وهن فايتين مزعهن طلعوا على القريه فرضوا عليها القتل والناس وفرضوا عليها أول مرة فرضوا عليها تقريبا مبالغ ما قدروش قاموا دفعوا لي جاني لموا مصاري كان ما فيش مصاري ومن يجيب لي ظل 50 ليرة من قاموا اعتقلوا 50 شاب وانا منهم وجابونا على كم في الرامي كم بالجيش ويشغلونا اشغال شاقه وقتل وعلى انا من اللي اعتقلونا على ليره وقعدونا شهر ونص واحنا ما احناش عارفين حالنا وين وهن ما يعرفوناش وين راحوا فينا.
The policy of applying collective punishments to villages suspected of harboring rebels had been used in Ireland. On the call from a bugle, the inhabitants had to leave their houses with their perishable goods, and their homes were then blown up in front of them.
When it was known that a particular community had committed an atrocity of some sort, that there could be a collective fine put on the village, and where it was known that a known gang leader had property, they would blow up his house. That was not confined just to Palestine. I think we did it in Iraq, usually by bombing, and we did it in the northwest frontier of India. And when I went out to Nigeria, there was still an old standing order that you could burn down an African village if there'd been trouble on. So it was not a problem confined just, a tactic confined just to Palestine.
During the uprising, 7,500 Palestinians were detained, 5,000 were killed in action, and 112 were executed. The leadership went into exile. The Palestinian uprising represented a major revolt against British colonial rule.
Effectively, the Palestinian community militarily was defeated, politically it was defeated, in the sense that the leadership itself was put in concentration camps, in exile, expelled from Palestine, so the Palestinian people were politically, if we can use the term, decapitated. After all, there is a certain asymmetry in the achievements and the status of the Jewish community of Palestine as a European community, coming from Germany, from Britain, from France, clearly countries that were technologically much more advanced, that had a much more effective base of social organization than the Palestinians, who were controlled by the Turks before, they're mostly rural, the high rate of illiteracy. So if we look at it was a contest not only between the Palestinian people and the Jewish community, which was much more advanced, but also a contest with the colonial power. That was the most powerful power in the world at that time.
A royal commission led by Lord Peel investigated the causes of the disturbances. It concluded that the Palestinian problem was fundamentally a conflict of right with right. The Peel Commission proposed partition, the creation of separate Arab and Jewish states, with Jerusalem still administered by Britain. The Palestinians were shocked that a government commission now called for the creation of a sovereign Jewish state. In September 1939, Europe was again engulfed in war. Once more, events in Palestine were to be overtaken by what happened elsewhere. For strategic reasons, the British decided to placate the Arabs and to severely restrict Jewish immigration into Palestine. The Jewish community responded with outrage. The British seemed to be reneging on the promises of the Balfour Declaration. The Zionists encouraged a policy of illegal immigration, and the first ships beached on the shores of Palestine on the eve of war. In occupied Europe, the Germans rounded up millions of Jews along with enemies of Nazism. Then, turning to what they called the final solution of the Jewish problem, the Nazis began a process of extermination, of genocide. In the death camps, a total of 6 million Jews were systematically gassed and burnt. When the facts of the Holocaust emerged, the world shuddered at the tragedy of the Jewish people. For many, the moral case for a Jewish state was now unanswerable.
I think the greatest problem, both for the Palestinian and for the Israeli and Jew in the world, whether Israeli or not, is somehow to make causal sense of the relationship, on the one hand, between what happened to the Palestinians, dispossession, exile, occupation, the shattering of Palestinian society in 1948, to connect that to the Holocaust. And Palestinians say, we played no role whatever in the Holocaust. Why are we asked somehow to uniquely to pay the price of the sacrifice of our land, indeed of our identity and patrimony, as restitution for this? And the Jew is asked also to confront the connection, which is, as the victims of the Holocaust, we are the people who have inflicted upon another people, I won't say another Holocaust, it would be wrong to say that, but we've inflicted upon another people a truly appalling fate. And we here are no longer the victims. We are the people who have taken the role of the oppressor. And that's a very difficult rather, equation for both Palestinians and Jews to deal with.
In the years after the war, the British continued to impose restrictions on the immigration of Jews from Europe. To the Zionists and their powerful sympathizers in America, this policy seemed inhuman, barbaric in the light of what had happened to the Jews, widely discrediting Britain's position in Palestine. Illegal immigrants were rounded up and sent back to Cyprus, some even back to Germany. Now it was the Zionists who took the offensive against British policy. The Zionist underground groups launched a campaign of violence to oust the British from Palestine. In July 1946, 91 people were killed when the King David Hotel was blown up.
There were frequent attacks upon the British in Palestine, against the army, against civilians, against, when King David was blown up, all the employers and were blown up in that hotel. We were shocked, of course, something new for us. This kind of warfare. We felt it was treacherous. And we couldn't explain it because we knew that the British had helped the Jews in all ways. They gave them much of the land in Palestine. They handed it over to the new settlers. They helped them in many ways, and we knew that. So we couldn't explain how the Jews were now attacking the British.
Britain leads in an 11th-hour drive to settle a dangerous problem. Mr. Attlee and Foreign Minister Bevin open the Palestine conference.
Britain was keen to carry America along with it, but a pro-Zionist stance by President Truman put Britain's relationship with America, so crucial to post-war reconstruction, under great strain. For Bevin, Palestine became an obsession.
You must remember that Bevin had been a trade unionist all his life. And he regarded, when he first came into office anyhow, he thought of international disputes as having the same character as industrial disputes. In other words, they must be solved by some sort of compromise. There was no other way. Now, that's a false narrative, of course.
All decent people must have been horrified by the murder by Jewish terrorists of the two British sergeants, Mervyn Pace and Clifford Martin. Their funeral took place at the Ramleh Cemetery with full military honors. The two sergeants, kidnapped as hostages, were hanged as a reprisal, the sort of cruelty once commonly indulged in by the Nazis. Until the appalling situation in Palestine is cleared up, unspeakable outrages may well continue.
It was at that stage that the government decided to put the question before the United Nations. In the first place, we made a request to the United Nations for advice on what to do next. Within the course of the proceedings in the United Nations, the government came to the conclusion that whatever conclusions the United Nations came to, we would, in any circumstances, withdraw.
I have been instructed by His Majesty's government to announce with all solemnity that they have consequently decided that in the absence of a settlement, they must plan for an early withdrawal of British forces and of the British administration from Palestine.
And after that, the British position was that we would not allow ourselves to be used for the implementation of any policy that was not acceptable to both the Arabs and the Jews, which meant virtually that we were not prepared to continue to take any responsibility in Palestine after the United Nations had reached whatever decision it was going to reach.
On the 29th of November 1947, after months of debate, the United Nations voted on the future of Palestine. The vote followed days of intensive lobbying by the Americans and Zionists. The recommendation was that Palestine should be partitioned. The Zionists welcomed the creation of a Jewish state. The Palestinians were aghast. The result remained uncertain until the final voting.
You all know how to vote. Those who are in favor will say yes, those who are against will say no. And the abstainers, always they know what to say.
So we will start it now.
Afghanistan, no. Argentina, abstention. Australia, yes.
Clearly, the Palestinian people do not have the right to self-determination, because the Palestinian people had expressed themselves against the establishment of two states in Palestine at that time. They wanted the independence and sovereignty of Palestine with its people, Palestinian Arabs and Palestinian Jews at the time. There was no Israel.
Ethiopia, abstain. France, yes.
The Zionists in the public gallery had expected the French to abstain.
That you will not have any interference on the voting, on the debate. I am confident on the way you will behave in a so serious decision taken by this assembly, because I am decided not to allow anybody to interfere in our decisions.
Well, I think the partition resolution that was adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations, in the first place, it was adopted by a General Assembly that was dominated by the same colonial powers that had endorsed the Balfour Declaration. You know, the representation of the Third World and the colonized was minimal at that time in the United Nations, and the powers, the few Afro-Asian powers, about 5 or 6, that were members of the UN, in fact, voted against.
South Africa, yes. Soviet Union, yes. United Kingdom, abstain. The United States, yes. Uruguay, yes. Venezuela, yes. 6, 10.
The resolution of the DUC Committee for Palestine was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against, 10 abstentions.
I think for most Palestinians, certainly of my generation, and perhaps even the generation that comes after mine, 1947-48 is still the pivotal year in our national existence. It is, after all, the year when, in a concerted way, the West, let's say the outside world, made its first massive intervention in our affairs with the Partition Resolution in November of 1947. It's the before and the after year, if you like.
The British were leaving Palestine, and the Zionists now had international backing for the creation of a Jewish state. For the Palestinians, the nightmare that had begun half a century earlier looked like becoming a reality.